This is a course of lectures and discussions on economics. The following three sessions focus on the contribution which a number of disciplines adjacent to economics have made to our understanding of human behavior, particularly psychology, sociology, and politics. And the first of these sessions starts with psychology. One of the wonders of neoclassical economics, in my view at any rate, is that although it derives all its conclusions from assumptions about human nature, it's been totally indifferent to what psychologists have actually said about human nature. It sets up a straw man, I think, this homo economicus, the rational calculating machine, and derives all its conclusions from the drives of this creature it's set up. But actually, that picture of human beings has very, very little relationship to what psychologists have discovered drive human action. Now, this is starting to change because after the crash of 2008, a lot of economists realized that their standard picture of human behavior was untenable. There was a lot of irrationality, a lot of things they couldn't explain, a lot of things that human beings did that were outside their models. And so you have the growth of behavioral psychology, which tries to fill this gap. We've yet to see how great its potential is and whether it can really shake the fundamental picture of the human being, which economics has decided to stick with for the last 200 years.
I think to the non-economist, the most striking fact about economics is the crudeness of its psychology. After all, psychology is the study of the human mind. In economics, it's used to explain why market participants behave in the way they do. If you really wanted to understand that, one approach would be to ask them why they behave in the way they do, to give reasons for the way they behave. But if these studies will inevitably turn out to be very complicated. So we end up by concluding there are so many reasons for people to behave the way they did that by no means consistent with each other, that we'll never really learn anything by that method. One way around of this has been to not bother with evidence at all and to start with assumptions about behavior, deduce the logical conclusions from those assumptions, and present the deductions as fact. And this has been the standard procedure in economics, and it has given rise to that wonderful character, homo economicus, the human calculating machine. For the economist, homo sapiens is homo economicus, that is the human robot. The human robot is perfectly rational, possesses all the relevant information, and knows exactly what it wants, and never makes a mistake in calculating how to get it. Her interaction with other human robots is purely instrumental and is unbound by any ties of social affection, loyalty, or anything else. If this seems a slightly unfair characterization of homo economicus, we need only take economists at their word. Nobel laureate Robert Lucas said, "My aim is to construct a mechanical, artificial world populated by interacting robots that is capable of exhibiting behavior, the gross features of which resemble those of the actual world." And that is the image of homo economicus. As Philip Pilkington has well put it, almost every contemporary mainstream economic theory seems to have homo economicus sitting in the driving seat. Homo economicus is the human micro-foundation of mainstream economics. Now, how is homo economicus supposed to behave? Neoclassical economists seem to believe two things about human actors. One is they maximize their utilities, aim for the biggest bang they possibly can, and B, they optimize. That is, they calculate the most efficient course of action among several options to achieve their goals. This gives the economist and everyone else a reliable basis for predicting their behavior. As I said in an earlier lecture, it's the economics equivalent of the force of gravity, which ensures that a continual tendency towards equilibrium. Now, it has to be said that many economists would regard this as a caricature of their beliefs. They deny that they hold people to be necessarily selfish or greedy, but they are committed to studying maximizing behavior, optimizing behavior, actually. And it's possible to insert altruism into this maximizing framework, certainly, but not obvious why altruism is best understood in a maximizing framework. It actually could be the case one has a much better understanding of what altruism is if one drops the maximizing assumption. But economists can't do that. Secondly, neoclassical economists wouldn't claim that individuals have the time or inclination to do the precise calculations for each transaction required by optimizing a behavior, or indeed that they have the computational capacity to do it. But they would claim that someone does the calculation for them. So they do, in fact, sufficiently know what the results of people's actions will be. The most general form in which this belief is expressed is that expectations will be rational if they are consistent with the correct model of the economy. In other words, that is, it's a secular form of the divine plan. What about homo economicus in action? Here are 3 examples. First I knew something about was Gary Becker's A Theory of Marriage, published in 1973. Becker argued that the selection of a partner takes place in a competitive market and marriages occur only when both partners are expected to gain. It's a very sophisticated theory, constructing a model of the complementary nature of male and female work, but ends up by treating marriage as little better than a cost-reducing mechanism. And of course, it does capture some reality. Historically, of course, there were property relations are involved in marriage and all kinds of things, and love. I mean, the romantic love as the bedrock of marriage probably only enters with the romantic movement of the 19th century. So there is some kind of basis for this, but still, I think most people would find it a bit distressing if that was how their marriage was, or their marriage choices were to be characterized. A second example comes from the work of John Steinson and Emi Nakamura. Now, this is random, just reading around. Paying someone else to fold your socks, they say, is a way to maximize your own earnings and those of the sock folder. So, even as penniless graduate students, these 2 economists borrowed money to pay people to do their household chores, calculating that spending an extra hour working on a paper was better for their lifetime expected earnings than spending that hour vacuum cleaning. So that seems to me homo economicus in action, not entirely a figment of the imagination. Notice they're 2 economists. So they're living up to their own prescription. Finally, 2 other economists, Betsy Stevenson and Justin Walters, pioneers of loveonomics, conducted a cost-benefit analysis before having a child. And as Wolfers explains, this is it's not a spoof, it's from serious scientific paper. The principle of comparative advantage tells us that gains from trade are largest when your trading partner has skills and endowments that are quite different from yours. I'm an impractical, bookish, Harvard-trained empirical labor economist, while Betsy is an impractical and bookish, Harvard-trained empirical economist. So they're both exactly the same. When your skills are so similar, the gains from trade aren't so large, except when it comes to bringing up our baby. There, Betsy has a pair of endowments that mean that she's better at inputs, and that means I'm left to deal with the outputs. Stevenson helpfully clarifies, it turns out that fathers can be pretty good at dealing with diapers as well. So, within the rational framework, this sort of homo economical framework, these arguments make a good deal of sense, don't they? Assuming, as neoclassical economists typically do, that what we want to do is to maximize our earnings because it is this which gives us access to material goods, we must admit that it is irrational to spend time dealing with matters which diminish our earning power if we could avoid it. Take our 2 economists who outsource their house cleaning. Their action can only really be understood as rational if they possess certain probabilities about their future lifetime earnings. They have no real basis for making such calculations, do they? The most they can reasonably say that it is more likely than not our lifetime earnings will be greater if we spend more time on our theses and less on our housework. Certainly, they cannot claim to know anything as precise as our expected lifetime earnings will be twice what they would be if we reduced our household work by 20%. The suspicion must be that in this example, the two economists are simply rationalizing their dislike of doing housework. Let me take a more winning example than folding socks. Say the greatest pleasure our economist gets is going to the movies. But she calculates that time spent at the movies will reduce the available time needed to maximize their earnings as an economist. So they cut out or minimize going to the movies, i.e. give up a present benefit for the sake of a doubtful benefit in the future. This is not rational, is it? Because there's no basis for calculating how much film going will need to be given up in order to maximize income later. How can you work that out? It may be you don't need your thesis anyway, that your career actually become an advertiser, and you don't need a thesis in economics. Outside that very limited field when future outcomes or probabilities are known, the neoclassical method leads to such absurd conclusions that one can calculate how much an hour working on an academic paper contributes to one's lifetime earnings. As Keynes correctly said, we have, as a rule, only the vaguest idea of any but the most direct consequences of our acts. In short, the normative prescription of neoclassical economics that humans should aim to be as like robots as possible is simply wrong. A great deal of what a person achieves in life is just down to luck. The cost of a future benefit may never be known, or it may not be known for hundreds of years, as with some creative artists who are only recognized long after their deaths. In such cases, surely it's far better to do what you want to do, or think that you're good at, or what you think of as good, and not waste time on doing calculations that lead you absolutely nowhere, just lead you into mad sort of field of pretend knowledge. It's rational to take precautions against known unknowns, but not unknown unknowns. So Homo economicus, although it's a favorite construct of neoclassical economics, turns out to be a totally fictional, useless, and I would say morally inadequate character, to put it mildly. Now let's turn to game theory, which is a variant of Homo economicus. I mean, Homo economicus plays games. Analytic game theory, starting, as you well know, with the prisoner's dilemma, queries the identification of rational self-interest with selfishness. The ultimatum game is a game where one player gets a lump sum on condition that he splits it, and the other player accepts the split. For example, A offers to be £1 and keeps £99. B rejects the £1. As a result, neither get anything. Now, B's rejection of the £1 would be considered to be irrational, because actually, as a result of rejecting this rather minimal offer, he ends up with zero. And of course, A ends up with zero as well. So the outcome is the worse for both. So what is the rational course of action? I mean, surely it would have been rational for A to offer the split more favorable to himself, but which B would find acceptable. So you get some sort of game going on, and in repeated rounds of this game, maybe you get something that can come out as rational. But it's Homo economicus always there, calculating It hasn't gone beyond that. So you could say player A offers something a bit more generous to B because he has altruism built into his utility function. Well, I don't know that you get very, very far doing that, and you can actually disprove that view of things as well. So what you're really left with is the attempt by behavioral economics to replace the absurd homo economicus, the human robot, by a more realistic actor. Behavioral game theory looks to examine how people actually play games and compares the results to the standard prescription. And that brings it to the insights of psychology and neuroscience, which are hitherto a closed book to economists. Eric Agner writes, there may be little difference in the normative foundations of neoclassical and behavioral economics. The difference, by and large, reflects differences in descriptive theory. That is, most people would be better off if they behaved as though they were homo economicus. But studies have shown that people do not, in fact, normally behave in the robotic way required by neoclassical economics. If they did, then they would be better off. But of course, trying to be realistic, you find that they don't. What is it that psychology tells us about human behavior? Well, behavioral economics came of age when Daniel Kahneman got a Nobel Prize in 2002 for work he'd done with Amos Tversky. It exists as a subset of economics. You may feel it's made bigger inroads and has more impact on the way economics is done than I'm about to describe. But I would say that it got a big boost with the crash of 2008, 2009. One of the leading texts predates it. Early behavioral economists relied on asking people to make hypothetical choices. Would you rather toss a coin for a half chance of $1,000 or get a certain $450? To settle for $450 is not rational, but this is what most people would do. So they're discovering little bits of irrationality in the choices people make. Another method asks people to consider the rationality of a situation, such as a colleague who, having decided a sweater was too expensive, was nonetheless happy when his wife bought it as a gift for him out of their joint bank account. Clearly irrational. Another example of irrationality. Next came field studies, studies observing people or using data collected for other purposes. More recent methods include process measures, looking for observable clues that hint strongly at the underlying thought process, process tracking, which looks to find out what information has been used to make a decision. Even more recently, neuroeconomists have made use of MRI scanners to try to detect what areas of the brain spring to life when a decision is made, though this method is very much in its infancy. Kahneman and Tversky have claimed that we make choices according to two mental systems, the first intuitive, the second calculating, which they label fast and slow thinking. They have found impressive evidence of irrational choices. For example, investors' preference for high-cost, actively managed funds which underperform index funds. Mainstream objectors have dismissed such examples as too quirky to upset standard predictions. And it is true that the examples of irrationality, they're often given in unreal or exotic situations or playing games of some kind that people don't normally play. But it's rather like Freud. I mean, the idea of trying to uncover the normal by study of the abnormal. And so I don't think the method should be dismissed automatically because the situations which are studied are very unreal normally, because they can throw light on the reality. But then on the other hand, some things are being discovered which have been perfectly obvious to everyone except neoclassical economists for years and years and years. For example, the discovery that the way choices are framed has an effect on the decision. Now, advertisers have known this ever since advertising first started. The Economist says, look, if something is worth £25 to you or $25 to you, buy it. If not, you don't. But a good ad frames the choice in such a way as to make it seem that you're getting a £50 worth of goods for £25. Quite literally, you're being framed. But I mean, it doesn't require a Nobel Prize. You don't get a Nobel Prize for pointing this out, do you? Or should you? I mean, admittedly, that's not the only thing that he pointed out. But I mean, this is an example. There's also, the sunk cost fallacy. That we all suffer from this. I mean, when we've invested a lot in something, we're very unwilling to give it up, even though rationally we should. I should really give up doing this, shouldn't I? But I've invested so much time in it and this, that, and the other, so I stick with it. I don't think any of this should come as a surprise, but it only comes as a surprise to someone who's buried themselves so deep within economics assumptions as to lose sight of reality. Why do you need to have a sophisticated economics to point these things out? I think the basic problem with these approaches is that they remain firmly individualistic. Society enters not as a real thing, but through the heads of isolated individuals. Okay, so we have another thing I want to consider, and that is heuristics. What economists call heuristics, everyone else calls rules of thumb. We all understand what rules of thumb are. While not rational in the neoclassical sense, to follow a rule of thumb is perfectly sensible when taking into account all the limitations faced by individual choice, such as time, information, and inability to perform complex mathematical operations in one's head. In philosophy, it's called rule utilitarianism, as opposed to act utilitarianism. But anyway, rule utilitarianism is the name of the game for central bankers, particularly. And then heuristics comes in different shapes and forms. The representative heuristic assumes that if an outcome looks representative of a process you think is being followed, it must indeed be being followed, and consequently that results which are similar to a typical one are more likely. In philosophy, the rule utilitarian follows rules which are generally useful and generally accepted. Then the availability heuristic is the idea that information that springs to mind most easily is weighted most heavily when making a decision. Quite often that's very reasonable. If you remember burning your hand when picking up a saucepan, you know to check next time. So that's called the availability heuristic. And then the affect heuristic is a reliance on good or bad feelings experienced following a stimulus. Affect-based evaluations are quick automatic feelings that we experience before having the chance to make a more reflective judgment, and it's what Kahneman calls fast thinking. One can think of many more examples of people using heuristics to anchor choices and the fallacies that can arise through statistical and other biases. The point, though, is that heuristics is an efficient way of producing reasonable estimates of what is likely to happen in the absence of a fully rational basis for calculating the effects of individual acts. And those are the methods by which most people in most societies use to make their choices. It's simply a fancy name for decision-making under uncertainty, in my view, whose roots lie in early theorists like Frank Knight and John Maynard Keynes. Critical here is Keynes's perception that on economic matters, 5 or 10 years down the line, there was no scientific basis for making any calculable probability, but that nevertheless the necessity for action and for decision compels us as practical people to do our best to overlook this awkward fact. And so he suggested we have 3 common rules we follow, which are heuristics. We assume the present will be a better guide to the future than an honest examination of past experience would show to be the case. We assume that existing opinion, as summarized by prices and the nature of output, is based on a correct assessment of future prospects. It's interesting that the Bank of England's forecasting models all assume that present prices are a reliable indicator of what future prices will be. In fact, it's stated quite explicitly that that's the case. That's an assumption, so that you can forecast interest rates in a year's time based on current market pricing of them, and that they will be reliable indicators of what they'll be. So this is Keynes saying people use this kind of basis for decision making because they don't actually know. And thirdly, knowing the limitations of our own judgment, we try to utilize the judgments of others by copying their behavior. In other words, this is the herd instinct. So it's all there, you see, in the general theory, only it's not in a model. I mean, you know, it's a nice, good narrative account of how people take decisions under conditions of uncertainty. And I think it's very insightful. And then Keynes goes on to say, and this is something I think that central bank modelers should have had in mind in the run-up to 2008. Now, a practical theory of the future based on these characteristics has certain marked characteristics. In particular, it is subject to sudden and violent changes. The practice of calmness and immobility, of certainty and security, suddenly breaks down. New fears and new hopes will, without warning, take charge of human conduct. The forces of disillusion may suddenly impose a new conventional basis of valuation. That is exactly what happened in 2008. We have just described as affect heuristics is simply Keynes's animal spirits. We've made huge advances, haven't we, between 1936 and 1980. We've relabeled something, the same phenomena, in slightly less penetrable prose. And that is, of course, the good indication of scientific progress. So I would say the main criticism to make of economists' attempt to model interactive behavior is that they haven't managed to link individual behavior to society. They aim to explain what happens in our heads, but have not successfully got hold of the link between what goes on in our heads and what goes on in other people's heads. For example, behavioral economics has nothing to say about crowd behavior. We all understand the importance of herd behavior in financial markets, the rush of the Gadarene swine to destruction, but this is the domain of sociology. And economics, as we know, is not very sociological. As soon as one talks about rules of thumb and rules of generally accepted behavior, one is implicitly introducing a sociological explanation of human behavior. And so in the next lecture, we shall aim to shed the loneliness of homo economicus and to explore how people interact socially, how society shapes our values, how we shape social institutions, and what social cooperation means. For those who have the stamina or the time to continue, we're moving now into what I call the material on which economic technique needs to be exercised.